Hello, my name is David Lance, and today I'd like to do another in my series on defending the American way of life. And so I want to look at the issue of climate change, and I have this specific kind of question for us. What if mankind was not the cause of climate change? If that were the case, then would all those special interests that are interested in making money off the issue of climate change really want to get involved if they couldn't get paid to fix the problem? So that's what we'll be looking at today. Now, you might remember that a few weeks ago, I did another particular video that I called God versus Gaia. I mentioned that back in about the year 1990, the TV cartoon series Captain Planet first aired when today's millennials were just little crumb crunchers. Also, before that, when I was in high school, Chiffon Margarine did a series of TV ads featuring Mother Nature and Chiffon Margarine saying it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. So they've been introducing the idea that was formed back in the 1960s by a James Lovelock that the Earth, like the Greek Earth goddess Gaia, is actually a living being that is sentient and can think. And so you might remember that I talked about that, saying that from a study that said, quote, this ecological hypothesis has also inspired analogies and various interpretations in social sciences, politics, and religion under a vague philosophy and movement. So today we're going to explore that a little bit further. Now, you may know by now that I created a course in 2020 called How to Teach with Technology Online. You can go to simplivelearning.com, search for the course, enter in the word WISE jargon, and be able to get a 25% discount. But my goal in doing these videos is to help you, the person that's watching this, to think about how you can take a subject that you're familiar with and defend the American way of life by learning how to make videos. Now, what I'm going to do in this series is something that I teach in one of the lessons in that course, which is to take a complicated issue and create a story in video. And so the first thing that you have to do is you have to find some sort of comprehensive report or series of reports on the topic that you're interested in that you know something about. And then what you need to do is you need to identify key quotes and maybe think of bullet points and comments that you can incorporate into your story. And then also what you want to be able to do is to imagine images and maybe even find some video clips that can tell the story as you present the information. Then you've got to organize all of this into a storyboard. Now, I like to use PowerPoint because I can move things around very easily, and I'm good with that. And I also have a section in my course, How to Teach with Technology Online, dedicated to using PowerPoint to make videos. So when you're all done with that, then you've got to edit, and finally record your video. And that's what I'm doing right now. And so the topic that I want to talk with you about today is the climate change con job. So are you ready? Let's go. So perhaps you've seen this particular picture. It's of an emaciated polar bear, and it popped up, I think, around the year 2006. And certainly, if you're familiar with Al Gore and his book called Earth in the Balance, and he was successful in getting that book and videos based on it into the public school systems. And all the school children said, oh my gosh, we're killing the poor polar bears. Climate change is terrible. We've got to stop it. Well, there's an 8-minute video that I found on a website called order.com that was done in 2017 that says that the experts were wrong about polar bears too. Now, you'll find out as we watch this that in 2005, there were a little over 22,000 polar bears known to be in existence. And within a few years, the polar bear population had skyrocketed by 30% up to about 30,000 bears. We're going to watch about 4 minutes of the video so you can see what these guys had to say. And so I'm going to hit play in just a moment and we'll listen to the recording.
In 2005, international polar bear specialists decided that future sea ice loss due to human-caused global warming had replaced wanton overhunting as the primary threat to polar bear survival. It was the first time that such future risks were used to decide a species conservation status. In 2007, American government biologists insisted that by 2050, when summer sea ice would cover 42% less of the Arctic than it did in 1979, polar bears in 10 populations most at risk would be wiped out. Almost 20,000 bears would be gone by mid-century, and by the end of the century, the species would be on the brink of extinction. The process had already begun, the experts said, and it would only get worse. Polar bears had become a global warming icon, the preferred symbol of the consequences of burning fossil fuels. The media, with the help of polar bear specialists and conservation organizations, made sure we were aware of each incident that signaled the dying of the species. A few polar bears were reported to have drowned in a storm.
A new scientific study shows that for the first time, they're finding polar bears that have actually drowned, swimming long distances, up to 60 miles, to find the ice.
Photographers filmed a bear or two breaking through thin ice and suggested yet another way drowning deaths could occur. A few photos of starving bears made headlines, usually accompanied by the suggestion that perhaps hundreds more were in the same condition. A few incidents of cannibalism also made headlines.
Tourists to Churchill recently witnessed this, an adult polar bear cannibalizing a cub. Some scientists say climate change and shrinking sea ice are to blame for this behavior. Inuit hunters say bear cannibalism happens, but a top polar bear researcher says it's happening way more than before.
This frenzy of dire news went on unchecked until 2007, when the first reports on polar bear studies undertaken since 2004 were made public. Surprisingly, the news from a new Davis Strait study wasn't grim, but encouraging. Not until about 2013, however, as more studies were completed, did it become clear that polar bears were thriving. Unfortunately, the media wasn't so keen on good news. If positive results were reported at all, the encouraging aspects were downplayed or dismissed, often using quotes from polar bear specialists themselves. It was as if polar bear scientists and their government funders wanted the public in the dark about the good news.
As the Arctic melts, the rush to exploit its resources is starting. Nobody will listen to her, but they'll listen to you.
What was going on? Summer sea ice had indeed declined, more than expected, in fact. By 2016, it was apparent that potentially devastating sea ice levels had come decades sooner than experts predicted. By September 2007, sea ice extent was about 43% less than it had been in 1979, a magnitude of decline not expected until mid-century. Polar bears have been living through their dire sea ice future since 2007.
Notice this is a plain stupid campaign advertisement of falling polar bears.
No unusual spikes in cannibalism occurred, and not a single polar bear population was wiped out.
Computer animated, by the way.
By 2015, new studies showed that several populations once thought to be declining had increased in size or remained stable.
And so what we see from all of this is that we have a series of situations where the polar bears were not dying off, they were actually thriving. Now, I'm not here to argue about whether or not the glaciers were melting. What I will discuss with you perhaps is that the reasons that they are melting are totally unrelated to anything man-made. And so let's talk about the climate change con job. You see, America and governments around the world have created a multi-billion-dollar climate change industrial complex. While elites get rich, the rest of us are stuck with paying the bill. And so, for example, there is a organization called Project Veritas. Veritas, by the way, is the Latin word for the English word truth. And recently, they were having a conversation with a person with CNN who claims that they caused Donald Trump to lose the presidential election, and that CNN hopes to target climate change awareness next in the year 2021. This was a conversation with Charlie Chester, a CNN technical director. And he said, quote, like our focus was to get Trump out of office, right? Without saying it, that's what it was, right? So our next thing is going to be climate change awareness, Chester said in another clip. And so you can go online and find the Project Veritas clip, but I found that to be an interesting thing about how the news media is wanting to promote various agendas, not necessarily to report the news. Now, perhaps you've heard of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She famously said a few years ago that the world is going to end in 12 years. And she was very adamant that we do something to address the issue. And she said, in fact, essentially, don't worry about how much it's going to cost, because if we don't take care of it, we're all going to die. She was feeding off of the things like the polar bear video that I just showed a few moments ago. Now, I happen to be a fan of science fiction, and a book that I really like is a book by Michael Crichton called State of Fear. Now, if the name Michael Crichton sounds familiar, that's because he's written lots of books that have been turned into movies. The first one that I'm aware of was called The Andromeda Strain. If you've ever seen Jurassic Park, he wrote that. He was also a writer and came up with the idea for the TV series ER. He actually has a master's in biology. And in fact, this book that I have here, it's The State of Fear, has a bibliography of scientific journals all related to the topic of, guess what? Climate change. And so his State of Fear is summed up in a quote on page 456, where one of the characters says, and I quote, "The politico-legal media complex is dedicated to promoting fear in the population under the guise of promoting safety." And that's from Michael Crichton's book, State of Fear. And so the idea is that what is called the PLMC complex will create a state of fear. So no matter what the elites tell us, we will be willing to do so that we won't die. And if it costs billions of dollars, well, it costs billions of dollars, but we'll be happy to pay it so that we won't die. Now, in politics, and I teach political science as a college level instructor, there's something called an iron triangle. The idea is that we have a legislative committee that basically passes budgets for various bureaucratic agencies. And the bureaucracies always want more money for what it is that they do. And so they are basically people from the agency talk to the members of the legislative committees to advocate for more money. I was a budget analyst in the state of Indiana in the legislature. I actually worked on budgets, and I know that that's what happens, whether it's in Congress in Washington or in your state capital. Now, you also have lobbyists who are basically working with people in specific agencies who they identify as friends. Now, I was also a lobbyist. One of the things that the lobbyists want to do is they want to represent the interests of various interest groups. And so sometimes you'll find lobbyists who become friends and collaborators with members of the bureaucracy. And in some cases, they even hire them. When I left state government, I became a lobbyist. And I basically, like many young people in those days, I was in my mid-20s, I traded on the fact that I had experience working inside the state legislature, and I knew specific legislators who I might at some point in the future be lobbying. And of course, these interest groups then provide contributions, campaign assistance, information to the politicians who sit on the legislative committees. And in this way, they get access and policy appointments within the bureaucracy, what is sometimes referred to as the deep state. And so interest groups love it when they get some of their employees appointed to high-ranking government positions. Now, do you think that ever happens? Trust me, it happens with both Republicans and Democrats. But I want to focus on the issue of climate change. So there's a guy by the name of Dr. Andrew Light. He is a university professor of No, not climate change. Philosophy. That's right. He has his PhD in philosophy, but he's been dealing with public policy and atmospheric sciences. He's been the director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. He's a distinguished fellow. He's done lots of things. He worked within the Obama administration and at one point worked for John Kerry when John Kerry was the Secretary of State. He also worked with John Podesta, who was the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Well, in 2018, when Donald Trump was president, there was a report that was authored. It was called the Fourth National Climate Assessment. It made the news because all of the 14 or 15 government agencies that were part of writing that report basically said that Donald Trump was wrong. Man-made climate change is happening. We need to do something about it. And one of the chief writers of the conclusions and policy recommendations was, you guessed it, Dr. Andrew Light. And so in an article that was published by the Washington Times, they said that he was a former administration official of the Obama administration, had worked with a group called the Center for American Progress, which is a liberal advocacy group that has been funded by billionaire George Soros, who funds a lot of things on the liberal left. His PhD is in philosophy, but he's worked for as a special U.S. envoy on climate change for John Kerry. And at the time that he was working on the Fourth National Climate Assessment, he worked as a senior fellow at something called the World Resources Institute. I find that to be important. This is one of those interest groups that's out there that actually operates globally and likes to get grants for funding from various projects. They've gotten them from private sector organizations as well as from the US government. Now, in a publication called cheddar.com, it said that Andrew Light, a distinguished senior fellow at the World Resources Institute and co-author of the report we just talked about, that federal climate change report, said that to Cheddar on Monday that the effects of climate change are imminent, and unless the federal government acts now, quote, it is threatening almost every sector of the economy, of course, more so those sectors that are dependent on natural resources, Light said. Quote, the U.S. federal government is not leading, even though we are seeing states and cities do quite a lot. Now, in 2018, when that report came out, people went after President Donald Trump to say, oh, you're terrible, you're not dealing with the climate change issue, and so forth. There was a PR black eye for President Trump. But one of the things that you didn't find out was that millions of government grants have flowed to the World Resources Institute. And so on their website, I went to look at their annual reports and discovered that from 2013 until 2016, the amount of money that they got from the federal government in grants increased from $3.98 million to $7.3 million. And then, of course, Donald Trump got elected, took office in 2017, and the grants began to decline. Well, at this point in time, by 2018, Dr. Light was working on that report that I just mentioned. Well, in January of 2021, the Biden administration hired Andrew Light to become a principal deputy assistant secretary within the U.S. Department of Energy. And the World Resources Institute, God bless their souls, issued a press release to say that they were pleased to announce that both he and another staff person, a lady by the name of Jennifer Wilcox, would be joining the federal government to help with climate change, and no doubt would be very interested in helping the World Resources Institute increase its federal grants from Washington under the Biden administration. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of Stephen Moore. He was an advisor on tax policy to the Trump administration. And back in 2018, he actually wrote an article titled Follow the Climate Change Money. And in that article, he wrote, how big is the climate change industrial complex today? Well, Forbes magazine went through the federal budget and estimated about $150 billion in spending on climate change and green energy subsidies during President Obama's first term. He wrote a lot more, and I would encourage you to go out there and Google his article. But one of the things he points out in the article is that after 3 decades of research, the only solution is for the world to stop using fossil fuels, which is like saying that we should stop growing food. Oh, by the way, have you heard of a report that says that in order to reduce methane emissions by cows, we should eat less meat? And there's been some discussion of cutting back meat consumption by Americans by 90%. Now, I'm not sure if President Biden has bought into that, but there are people out there in the environmental climate change world that are advocating that sort of thing. And who knows if that will or won't make it into a policy recommendation that the new president will follow. Well, I just want to bring all this to your attention. A good question to ask is, if humankind is not the principal driver in climate change, what is? And so in our next video on this topic, I will look at some actual science that suggests various things that are happening because of certain planetary changes that we can't affect and can't control, and therefore nobody can make any money off of by saying that these are the problems. But that's something to wait for until next time. And so I hope that this has been a very educational discussion for you. And until next time, thanks so much and God bless.